Massive teardrop pearls dangle from his ears. His face is coated in a powder as deathly white as a shroud, and the cloying scent of musk and cinnamon struggles to mask the stench of a decomposing dynasty. Paris, in the late summer of 1589, is no city of light. It is a dungeon of dread. Through narrow alleys reeking of filth and rotting waste, fanatical mobs howl for the blood of their king. They curse him as a demon in human form, a sorcerer sent by Satan to drown France in a sea of fire. A few miles away, at the camp of Saint-Cloud, this monster sits in silence. This is Henri III. Though only 37, he is as haggard as a man at the end of a long, bitter life. His eyes, those famous melancholic eyes of the House of Valois, hold no malice. Instead, they are filled with a crushing, bottomless loneliness. Once the golden boy of Catherine de Medici, the prince promised every glory, how did he come to end his days in a soldier's tent, waiting for an assassin's blade already closing in? This is more than the story of a king. It is the autopsy of a dynasty rotting from the inside out. The House of Valois had ruled France for over 200 years. They were the architects of the nation, the warrior kings who had driven the English into the sea during the 100 Years' War. But by the mid-1500s, something had gone wrong with the Valois blood. The vitality that had defined their ancestors seemed to have curdled into madness, sickness, and instability. It was an era of transition, a painful birth pang between the medieval world and the modern one. The Renaissance had brought art, culture, and philosophy to France, but it had also brought a questioning of the old order. And then came the Reformation. When Martin Luther nailed his theses to the church door in Germany, the shock waves cracked the foundation of the French monarchy. Suddenly the king was not just a ruler. He was a combatant in a war for the soul of humanity. France was splitting into two armed camps, the Huguenots, Protestants, and the Catholics. This was the world Henri's parents inhabited. His father was King Henri II, a hulking, silent man who loved hunting, jousting, and war. He was a king of the old school, brave, physical, and not particularly intellectual. But the real power, the dark gravity that held the court together, was his wife, Catherine de Medici. History has been unkind to Catherine. We picture her as the Black Queen, a wicked witch mixing poisons in the basement of the Louvre, surrounded by astrologers and spies. And while there is truth to that, she was certainly ruthless. She was also a woman trying to survive in a shark tank. She was an Italian in a French court that despised her. For the first 10 years of her marriage, she was barren, humiliated by her husband's open adoration of his mistress, the glamorous Diane de Poitiers. Catherine learned early that survival meant silence. It meant watching, waiting, and hiding your true intentions behind a mask of impassivity. It was a lesson she would teach her favorite son well. Eventually, the Medici magician did her duty. She produced children, lots of them, but the Valois curse was waiting. The children were sickly. They were prone to respiratory infections, to tubercular ulcers, to strange fevers. It was as if their bodies could not contain the weight of their lineage. Henri, born on September 19, 1551, at the Château de Fontainebleau, was the fourth son. In the brutal mathematics of royal succession, a fourth son is a redundancy. He is the spare to the spare. He was christened Alexandre Edouard, a name he would bear for his childhood. The world paid him little attention. All eyes were on his eldest brother, Francis the Dauphin, and his other brothers, Charles and Louis. Henri was destined for the church, or perhaps a wealthy dukedom, a life of comfortable obscurity on the sidelines of history. But fate, it seems, had a cruel sense of humor. From the moment he could walk, it was clear that Alexandre Edouard, our Henri, was different. While his father and older brothers were obsessed with the rough and tumble of the training yard, with hawks and hounds and swords, Henri was a creature of the indoors. He was a beautiful child, possessing a delicate, almost feminine grace that set him apart. He had his mother's large, expressive eyes and his father's athletic build, but he moved with a dancer's elegance. Catherine de Medici, a woman who had fought so hard for her place in the world, saw something of herself in this fourth son. She saw an intelligence, a sharpness of mind that her other sons lacked. Francis was sickly and dull. Charles was erratic and prone to violent rages. But Henri was clever. He was witty. He loved books, he loved clothes, he loved the beautiful things that Catherine had brought with her from Florence. She doted on him with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. She called him her cher yeux, her precious eyes. In the cold, drafty corridors of the royal palaces, where affection was usually a bargaining chip, Catherine's love for Henri was the one burning, constant reality. She kept him close to her skirts, whispering secrets of statecraft to him before he was even out of short pants. She taught him that the world was a dangerous place, that trust was a weakness, and that a king or a prince must always wear a mask. But there was a shadow in the boy, too, a strange, volatile darkness that hinted at the turmoil to come. He was a child of contradictions. He could be incredibly charming, winning over seasoned diplomats with a smile, and then in the next moment he could be seized by a terrifying aggression. There is a story from his childhood that historians often cite as a chilling foreshadowing of his reign. Young Henri was deeply, performatively religious, obsessed with the rituals and theatrics of Catholicism. Yet, in a fit of inexplicable rage, he once attacked a statue of St. Paul, biting the nose off the stone figure. It was a bizarre, almost feral act. Was it a tantrum? Was it a sign of mental instability? Or was it the first crack in the psyche of a boy who was being pulled in too many directions? He bullied his sister Margaret, the future Queen Margot, relentlessly. He would mock her, tease her, and pressure her to convert to Protestantism, only to swing back the next day and berate her for not being Catholic enough. He was a pendulum swinging wildly, searching for a center of gravity that he would never quite find. When Henri was just 7 years old, the first domino fell. The year was 1559. To celebrate a peace treaty with Spain, King Henri II held a magnificent jousting tournament in Paris. The king, proud of his physical prowess, insisted on riding in the lists himself. He wore the colors of his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, a final insult to Catherine. Catherine had begged him not to ride. Her astrologer, the infamous Nostradamus, had allegedly predicted that the king would die in a duel, that a young lion would overcome the old one, piercing his eye through a golden cage. The king laughed it off. He was Henri of Valois. He was invincible. He rode against the young captain of his Scottish guard, Gabriel de Lorges, Count of Montgomery. It was a freak accident. Montgomery's lance shattered upon impact. A jagged splinter of wood flew up, pierced the king's gilded visor, and drove deep into his eye, entering the brain. The king did not die immediately. He lingered for days in excruciating agony. The doctors, desperate to save him, tested procedures on criminals, driving wood into their eyes to see how to remove the splinter. Nothing worked. Henri II died screaming. His death shattered the stability of France. The strong, authoritarian hand that had kept the religious factions in check was gone. In his place sat Henri's eldest brother, Francis II. Francis was 15 years old, but physically and mentally he was a child. He was completely dominated by his wife's uncles, the powerful and ambitious Guise brothers. The Guises were ultra-Catholic hardliners. They saw the Protestants not just as heretics, but as traitors to be exterminated. Under their influence, the persecution of Huguenots intensified. The cycle of violence began to spin faster. For young Henry, watching from the shadows, this was a formative lesson. He saw how quickly power could vanish. He saw how the great lords of France, the Guises, the Bourbons, the Montmorencys, circled the throne like wolves waiting for the fire to die down. He saw his mother, dressed now in the eternal black mourning she would wear for the rest of her life, fighting desperately to maintain her influence against men who despised her. And then the Valois curse struck again. After reigning for only a year, Francis II developed an ear infection. It turned gangrenous. He died in shivering delirium, leaving no heir. The crown passed to the next brother, Charles IX. Charles was 10 years old. A 10-year-old boy was now the only thing standing between France and total anarchy. Catherine de Medici was declared regent. She was now officially the most powerful woman in Europe, ruling in the name of her son. But Charles was a troubled boy. He was emotionally unstable, prone to fits of manic violence where he would slaughter animals or beat his servants, followed by periods of weeping exhaustion. Amidst this chaos, our Henri, now the Duke of Anjou, began to shine. While Charles IX struggled under the weight of the crown, Henri began to discover his own power. He was growing into a strikingly handsome young man. He was tall, with a lithe, athletic build. He had a flair for fashion that was already turning heads. He loved rich velvets, Italian silks, and jewels. But he wasn't just a fop. Underneath the satin, there was steel. Catherine saw that Charles was weak. She needed a sword to protect the throne, and she decided that Henri would be that sword. She began to groom him not for the priesthood, but for war. At the age of 16, Henri was appointed lieutenant general of the kingdom. It was an absurd promotion on paper, a teenager put in command of the royal armies. The old generals grumbled. They thought this pampered prince would faint at the sight of blood. They were wrong. Henri took to the military life with a surprising natural aptitude. Perhaps it was the structure of the army that appealed to him, or the clarity of the battlefield where friend and foe were clearly defined, so unlike the murky, poisonous atmosphere of the court. He was brave, sometimes recklessly so. He rode at the front of the charge, his armor gleaming, a white plume in his helmet. But he was also intelligent. He listened to his advisors, the veteran Gaspard de Sceaux, Marshal Tavannes. He learned how to read terrain, how to manage supply lines, how to use cavalry to break an infantry square. In 1569, the religious tensions finally exploded into the Third War of Religion. The Huguenot armies, led by the Prince of Condé and Admiral Coligny, were marching. The crown needed a victory. They got two. At the Battle of Jarnac, Henri led the royal army to a crushing victory. The Protestant leader, the Prince of Condé, was killed, shot in the back of the head after he had surrendered. It was a brutal, dishonorable act, but to the Catholic League, it was divine justice. Henri was hailed as a hero. Months later, at the Battle of Moncontour, Henri did it again. He smashed the Huguenot forces. He had a horse shot out from under him, but he kept fighting. When he returned to Paris, the city went wild. They called him the New Alexander, the Hammer of Heretics. Women threw flowers in his path. Poets wrote sonnets about his bravery. For the first time in his life, Henri was not just the spare, he was the star. But every light casts a shadow, and the shadow this time fell across the throne. King Charles IX, sitting in the Louvre, watched his younger brother's triumph with a simmering, cancerous jealousy. Charles was the king, but Henri was the hero. Charles was the ruler, but Henri was the one the people loved. The relationship between the brothers, never warm, turned toxic. Charles began to mock Henry's fashion, his friends, his mannerisms. He called him the little king. Catherine, always the pragmatist, tried to manage the rivalry, but she made it worse by openly favoring Henry. She would interrupt council meetings to praise Henry's letters from the front. She would defer to Henry's opinion on matters of state, ignoring the king. Henry, for his part, was becoming arrogant. Success had intoxicated him. He began to surround himself with a clique of young, aggressive noblemen who shared his taste for violence and luxury. They were the prototypes of the mignons who would later define his reign. He started to interfere in court politics, conspiring against his own sister, Margaret, breaking up her romance with the young Duke of Guise because he feared their alliance would threaten his own position. He was 18 years old. He was the most famous man in France. He had a mother who worshipped him, an army that followed him, and a brother who hated him. He thought he was invincible. He didn't realize that the real war, the war for his soul, was just beginning. The storm clouds that had been gathering over the Valois Dynasty were about to break with a violence that would echo through the centuries. Henry, now a young man drunk on his own military success and his mother's favor, stood on the precipice of a decision that would define his soul. He believed he was fighting a political war, a game of chess against the Protestant faction, but the pieces on the board were living, breathing human beings. As the capital filled with unsuspecting guests for a wedding intended to heal the nation, the young prince did not see a celebration. He saw a target-rich environment. The festivities were merely a thin veneer of gold leaf over a rotting structure, and the heat rising from the Parisian cobblestones was about to be matched by the fires of religious fanaticism. The summer of 1572 in Paris was oppressive. The heat hung over the city like a wet wool blanket, trapping the stench of the open sewers and the nervous sweat of a population on the brink. But amidst the squalor, the Louvre was a frantic hive of silk and gold. A wedding was being prepared, and not just any wedding. This was the wedding of the century, a union designed to stitch the bleeding wounds of France back together. The bride was Henry's sister, the brilliant and rebellious Margaret of Valois, known to history as Queen Margot. The groom was Henri of Navarre, the rough-hewn, charismatic leader of the Protestant faction, a Catholic princess marrying a Protestant king. It was Catherine de Medici's masterstroke of diplomacy. If they could just get these two to say, "I do," perhaps the civil wars would finally end. But for our Henry, the Duke of Anjou, this wedding was a bitter pill. He despised Henri of Navarre. Navarre was everything Henry was not. Unrefined, smelling of garlic and horse sweat, a man who preferred the campfire to the ballroom. Yet Navarre possessed a rugged, effortless masculinity that made Henry's perfumed elegance seem fragile by comparison. Henry watched from the sidelines. His eyes narrowed as the Huguenot nobility poured into Paris for the celebration. They came in their hundreds, battle-hardened Protestant lords who had spent the last decade trying to kill the Valois. Now they were walking the halls of the Louvre, armed and arrogant, sneering at the Catholic icons. The tension was palpable. The air was so thick with hatred you could choke on it. The ultra-Catholic population of Paris watched with horror as heretics paraded through their streets. They whispered that the king had betrayed God. Henry, ever the political animal, played his part. He smiled at the right people. He bowed to the men he wanted to kill, but behind closed doors he was whispering in his mother's ear and in the ear of his unstable brother, King Charles IX. The argument was simple. The Protestants are here. They are armed. They are in our home. If they wanted to, they could cut our throats in our sleep. The wedding took place on August 18th. It was a strange, disjointed affair. The bride, Margaret, allegedly refused to say yes, so the king, her brother Charles, pushed her head down to force a nod. Henry stood by, watching the farce unfold. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, that peace built on such a foundation could not stand. 4 days later, the first shot was fired. Admiral Coligny, the revered leader of the Protestants and a father figure to the king, was walking back to his lodgings when an assassin fired an arquebus from a window. The bullet smashed into Coligny's arm and tore off a finger, but it did not kill him. Chaos erupted. The Protestants were furious. They demanded justice. They threatened to burn the Louvre down if the assassin was not found. Inside the palace, panic set in. Catherine de Medici and Henri knew the truth. The assassination attempt had likely been their doing, or at least done with their blessing, perhaps in collusion with the Guise family. They had hoped to kill the head of the snake and scatter the Protestants. Instead, they had only wounded the beast, and now it was cornered and angry in their own house. The night of August 23rd, 1572, the eve of St. Bartholomew's Day, is one of the darkest moments in human history. In the private chambers of the king, a desperate council was held. Catherine, Henri, and their closest advisors surrounded the hysterical King Charles IX. They spun a web of lies and terror. They told Charles that the Protestants were planning a coup. They told him that at dawn the Huguenots would rise up and murder the entire royal family. They told him there was no way out. The only way to survive was to strike first. "We must kill them," they urged, "not just Coligny, all of them, the leaders, the captains. We must cut the head off the Hydra." Charles, weeping and pacing, finally snapped. In a moment of madness that would seal his doom, he screamed the infamous words, "Well then, kill them, but kill them all. Don't leave a single one alive to reproach me." The order was given. Henri was 20 years old. He was the lieutenant general of the kingdom. This was his operation. As the bells of the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois began to toll in the pre-dawn gloom, the signal was given. The Duke of Guise led his men to Coligny's lodgings. They butchered the old admiral in his bedroom and threw his body out the window onto the cobblestones, where Guise kicked the corpse to make sure he was dead. But then the surgical strike went wrong. The militia of Paris, whipped into a religious frenzy, heard the bells. They didn't just target the leaders, they targeted everyone. The city exploded into an orgy of violence. Neighbors broke down the doors of neighbors. Men, women, and children were dragged into the streets and hacked to pieces. The Seine River, the artery of Paris, turned a sluggish, opaque red. Bodies piled up against the bridges like drift logs. Henri rode through the city during the massacre. Accounts of his behavior vary. Some say he actively participated, hunting down enemies. Others say he was horrified by the scale of the slaughter, that he tried to save a few chosen friends. But the result was the same. He was the hero of the hour for the Catholics. He had cleansed Paris. But the psychological toll on the Valois family was immediate. King Charles IX, who had given the order, began to disintegrate. He claimed he could hear the screams of the dying in the air, even when the room was silent. He saw ravens perched on the Louvre, dripping blood. Henri, however, compartmentalized the horror. He was a creature of survival. He had done what was necessary, or so he told himself. But the blood of St. Bartholomew would stick to him. It stained his reputation across Europe. To the Protestant powers, England, Germany, the Netherlands, he was now a butcher. Catherine de Medici was a woman who looked at the chessboard 5 moves ahead. She saw 2 problems. First, France was still a powder keg. Second, the rivalry between Charles IX and Henri was becoming dangerous. Charles was consumed by guilt and jealousy. He looked at Henry, the hero of the Catholics, the golden boy, and he wanted to kill him. Catherine needed to get Henry out of Paris. She needed to get him a crown of his own, far away from the toxic atmosphere of the Louvre. The opportunity came from the unlikeliest of places, Poland. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a massive elective monarchy. Their king had died, and the Polish nobles were looking for a new sovereign. Catherine launched a massive diplomatic campaign, bribing, cajoling, and flattering the Polish electors. She painted Henry as the greatest warrior in Christendom, a Solomon of wisdom, a second Alexander. Henry wanted no part of it. He had no interest in Poland. He had heard it was a frozen wasteland inhabited by barbarians who drank vodka for breakfast and dueled in the snow. More importantly, he had fallen in love. Her name was Marie de Cleves. She was the wife of the Prince of Condé, a Protestant. But Henry didn't care. She was beautiful, intelligent, and kind. For a man who had spent his life in a pit of vipers, Marie was a breath of fresh air. She was the one pure thing in his life. He dreamed of marrying her. He fantasized that if Charles died, which looked increasingly likely, he would become King of France, annul Marie's marriage, and make her his queen. But Catherine would not be denied. In May 1573, the news arrived. Henry had been elected King of Poland. He was devastated. He delayed his departure for months. He lingered in Paris, spending every stolen moment he could with Marie. He threw lavish parties. He fell ill, conveniently. He laid siege to the Protestant stronghold of La Rochelle, a brutal, miserable military campaign where he lost thousands of men and achieved nothing, just to delay the inevitable journey. Finally, Charles IX had had enough. He practically threw Henry out of the country. "Go," he reportedly shouted. "France is not big enough for both of us." Henry's journey to Poland was a slow, mournful funeral procession. He traveled through Germany, where Protestant princes spat at his carriage, calling him the Butcher of Paris. When he finally arrived in Krakow in the dead of winter, his heart sank. The Wawel castle was magnificent, but it was freezing. The Polish nobles were boisterous, independent, and demanded a king who would drink with them and listen to their endless debates in the same. Henry, with his perfumes, his earrings, and his refined Italian manners, was a creature from another planet. He hated it. He isolated himself in his private chambers, refusing to learn the language. He wrote letter after letter to Marie de Cleves, letters written in his own blood, pricking his finger to mix the crimson with the ink. He was a king, but he felt like a prisoner. He spent his days planning renovations for the castle and his nights weeping for the life he had left behind. He ruled Poland for only 146 days. In June 1574, a courier arrived at Wawel Castle. He was covered in dust, his horse foaming. He carried a letter from Catherine de Medici. It was short and coded, but the message was clear. Charles IX was dead. The king had died a miserable death, sweating blood from his pores, crying out that he was burning in hell for the massacre. He was 23 years old. Henry was now King of France, but the Poles would not let him go easily. They had elected him for life. They expected him to stay. Henry knew that if he asked for permission to leave, the same would debate it for months. By then his younger brother, the treacherous Duke of Alençon, or the Guises, might seize the French throne. He had to run. On the night of June 18th, 1574, the King of Poland held a grand feast. He smiled, he drank, he toasted the nobles. He seemed resigned to his fate. But as the candles burned low and the guests drunkenly stumbled to their beds, Henry slipped away. He met a small group of loyal French courtiers at a side gate. Horses were waiting. In the silence of the Polish summer night, the King of Poland fled his own kingdom like a thief. When the Poles discovered his flight the next morning, They were furious. Tartar cavalrymen were sent to chase him down. It was a high-stakes race across the plains of Eastern Europe. Henri rode until his thighs were raw, changing horses, never looking back. He crossed the border into Austria just hours ahead of his pursuers. He was free. He was going home. Henri did not rush back to France immediately. He took a winding route through Italy, soaking in the culture of Venice and Turin. He was greeted as a hero, treated to carnivals and masquerades. For a few months he could pretend that the weight of the crown did not exist. He was young, he was king, and he was in love. He arrived in Lyon in September 1574. His mother, Catherine, was there to meet him. She embraced him, tears streaming down her face. Her precious eyes had returned. The dynasty was saved. But Henri had only one question. Where is she? Where is Marie? Catherine's face fell. The news had been kept from him during his travels. Marie de Clèves had died in childbirth a few weeks earlier. The impact on Henri was catastrophic. It wasn't just grief, it was a total psychological collapse. The man who had ridden through the slaughter of St. Bartholomew without flinching now crumbled. He locked himself in his room for days. When he finally emerged, he was a different person. He refused to wear royal purple. Instead, he designed a bizarre mourning costume, black velvet covered in embroidered silver skulls and crossbones. He tied death's head rosaries around his waist. He looked like a walking memento mori. The court was shocked. They expected a warrior king to crush the Protestants. Instead, they got a grieving widower who seemed to have lost his grip on reality. But Henri had to marry. The dynasty needed an heir. He rejected all the foreign princesses Catherine proposed. He didn't want a political alliance. He wanted a ghost. He chose Louise de Lorraine, a shy, quiet girl from a minor branch of the Guise family. Why? Because she bore a startling physical resemblance to Marie de Clèves. He married her, but he treated her more like a sister or a living doll than a wife. He would spend hours dressing her, doing her hair, treating her with a gentle, distant affection. But there was no passion, and crucially, there were no children. As the months turned into years, the lack of an heir became a crisis. And as Henri retreated further into his private world of grief and oddity, the wolves began to circle again. The Protestants were rebuilding their armies. The Catholic League was growing impatient. And in the shadows, the Duke of Guise, the man who had kicked Coligny's corpse, was beginning to wonder if perhaps he looked more like a king than the man on the throne. This profound psychological fracture marked the death of Henri the warrior and the birth of Henri the enigma. Having lost the only woman who made him feel human and trapped in a marriage that felt like a hollow duty, the king turned his back on the brutal reality of his kingdom. If France wanted a ruler, they would have to find one in the shadows, for Henri was done with the light. He decided that if he could not control the chaos outside the palace walls, he would construct a perfect artificial world within them, a sanctuary built of silk, secrets, and suffocating intimacy where he could hide from the ghosts of St. Bartholomew. By 1576, the Louvre had transformed. Under the reigns of Francis I and Henri II, the French court had been a place of martial vigor, a parade of knights and hunters. Under Henri III, it became something else entirely, a surreal, hermetically sealed theater where reality was kept at bay by velvet curtains and clouds of violet-scented powder. The king had retreated from the world. The trauma of the massacre, the freezing exile in Poland, and the death of Marie de Clèves had forged a man who found comfort only in a small, intense circle of intimacy. He surrounded himself with a group of young men who would become infamous in history as the mignons, the darlings, or the cuties. To the rough, battle-hardened nobility of France, the Mignons were a grotesque aberration. These were men like Caylus, Maugiron, Saint-Mégrin, Épernon, and Joyeuse. They were young, devastatingly handsome, and fiercely loyal to the king, but it was their appearance that scandalized the nation. They mimicked the king's eccentric style to an exaggerated degree. They wore their hair long and curled, often powdered in strange colors like violet or orange. They plucked their eyebrows into thin arches. They wore heavy makeup, rouge on their cheeks, lip salve, and masks of egg white to preserve their complexions. Their clothes were a riot of ruffles and starch. Their famous cartwheel ruffs were so immense that their heads seemed to float on white platters, completely detached from their bodies. They were creatures of excess, dripping in pearls and gold chains, walking with a mincing gait that the satirists of Paris mocked mercilessly. Rumors of sodomy, the Italian vice, swirled around the Louvre like a noxious fog. Pamphlets were distributed in the streets, depicting the king and his favorites in orgies, accusing Henri of being a Ganymede, enslaved by his passions. But the truth of the Mignons was more complex than the crude pornography of the streets suggested. These were not soft men. Beneath the makeup and the silk, they were killers. They were some of the finest swordsmen in France, possessing a terrifying, reckless courage. They were the king's Praetorian Guard, his only line of defense in a court teeming with potential assassins. Henri loved them not just for their beauty, but because they belonged to him completely. In a world where his brother, his mother, and his generals were all playing 4D chess with his crown, the Mignons were his creatures. He raised them from minor nobility to dukes and peers, showering them with wealth that the bankrupt state could ill afford. The atmosphere of the court was schizophrenic. One moment the king would be organizing elaborate balls where men dressed as women and women as men, events of such hedonistic splendor that they nearly bankrupted the treasury. The next moment the mood would swing violently to the macabre. The king developed a mania for the bilboquet, the cup and ball game. He would walk through the halls of the Louvre for hours, the click-clack of the ivory ball landing in the cup echoing through the corridors, a maddening metronome ticking away the final hours of the dynasty. His favorites followed suit, and soon the entire court was clicking away, a childish distraction, while the country burned. If Henri's hedonism confused his subjects, his piety terrified them. The king was a man torn between the flesh and the spirit. He felt the weight of his sins, the massacre, the lust, the vanity crushing him. He was terrified of hell. In an attempt to appease a god he felt was angry with him, Henri introduced a new, darker form of religious observance to the court, the brotherhood of penitence. Imagine the scene. It is midnight in Paris. The streets are dark. Suddenly, a procession emerges from the gates of the Louvre. It is a line of hooded figures, dressed in sacks of rough burlap with holes cut for the eyes, resembling the executioners of the Inquisition. They carry torches and whips. They chant the Miserere in low, droning voices. At the head of the procession, barefoot on the cold cobblestones, is the King of France. He whipped himself. He walked for miles in the rain. He forced his mignons, men who preferred satin to sackcloth, to join him. They would spend days in the monastery of the Hieronymites, living in cells, fasting, and praying for forgiveness. To the people of Paris, this was not holiness. It was madness. They saw a king who would host a drag ball on Saturday and whip himself on Sunday. It felt performative, unstable. The Catholic League, the ultra-religious faction led by the Guise family, used this against him. They argued that a king who was so mentally erratic could not be the defender of the faith. They whispered that his penitence was a sham, a cover for darker, satanic rituals performed in the bowels of the palace. Henri was trying to find salvation, but he only found ridicule. He was a man screaming into the void, but the only answer he got was the echo of his own desperation. While Henri III was busy clicking his bilboquet and whipping his back, another man was rising. Henri de Lorraine, the Duke of Guise, was everything the king was not. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and scarred. He bore a jagged scar across his cheek from a battlefield wound, earning him the nickname Le Balafré, the scarred one. To the people, that scar was a badge of honor, a sign that he had bled for France. Guise was a master of populism. He knew how to talk to the fishmongers in the market and the priests in the pulpit. He walked the streets of Paris without guards, shaking hands, kissing babies, and buying rounds of wine in the taverns. He was the king of Paris in all but name. He was also the head of the Catholic League, a paramilitary organization funded by Spanish gold. The League's goal was ostensibly to wipe out Protestantism, but its true purpose was to seize power. Guise looked at the Valois Dynasty, weak, effeminate, childless, and saw a rotting tree waiting to be pushed over. He traced his lineage back to Charlemagne and began to quietly circulate the idea that the Valois were usurpers, that he was the true heir to the ancient kings of France. The rivalry between Henri III and the Duke of Guise was the central tragedy of the era. They had been childhood friends. Henri had once admired Guise, but now they were locked in a death spiral. Henri sat in the Louvre, surrounded by his painted darlings, while Guise rode through the streets, soaking up the adoration of the mob. The tension was unbearable. It had to break. And when it did, it wasn't on a battlefield, but in a park, in a senseless explosion of testosterone and vanity. It was April 27th, 1578. The location was the horse market near the Bastille. The rivalry between the King's Mignon and the Duke of Guise's followers had reached a boiling point. Insults had been exchanged. Mistresses had been stolen. It was a gang war played out in velvet doublets. Jacques de Lévis, Count of Caylus, was one of the king's absolute favorites. He was arrogant, beautiful, and deadly. He had gotten into a dispute with Charles de Balzac, Baron of Entraigues, a follower of the Guise faction. They agreed to a duel, but this was not a standard duel. In the 16th century, seconds usually stood by and watched to ensure fair play. But on this day, the bloodlust was so high that the seconds decided to fight as well. It became a melee, 3 against 3. Caylus, Maugiron, and Livarot fought for the king. Entraigues, Ribérac, and Schomberg fought for the Guise. At 5 a.m., as the sun was just beginning to burn off the mist, they drew their rapiers. There was no politeness, no chivalry. It was a slaughter. Maugiron was killed almost instantly, run through the heart. Schomberg was hacked down, dying on the muddy ground. Ribérac was mortally wounded and would die in agony the next day. Livarot took a sword to the head and spent weeks in a coma, though he miraculously survived for a while. Entraigues, the man who started it, escaped with a minor scratch. And Caylus, the king's beloved Caylus, he was a mess. He had been stabbed 19 times, 19 distinct wounds, yet, incredibly, he was still alive. When news of the duel reached the Louvre, Henri collapsed. He rushed to the house where Caylus had been taken. The scene that followed was one of the most pathetic and moving displays of royal grief in history. The King of France sat by the bedside of his favorite for 33 days. He refused to leave. He offered the surgeons 100,000 francs if they could save him. He fed Caylus broth with his own hands. He prayed, he wept, he bargained with God. But the wounds were too severe. On May 29th, Caylus died in the king's arms. Henry's reaction was catastrophic for his image. He did not grieve like a king, he grieved like a widow. He cut off the beautiful blonde hair of Caylus and Maugiron and kept it as a relic. He removed the earrings from their dead bodies and wore them himself. He ordered a magnificent state funeral. He built a grand marble mausoleum for them in the church of St. Paul, adorned with statues of the young men. The court was scandalized. These were not princes of the blood. They were minor nobles who had died in a street brawl. To give them a burial fit for kings was a blasphemy. The people of Paris sneered. They called the mausoleum the Seraglio of the Mignons. The poets wrote vicious verses. The duel of the Mignons was a turning point. It stripped away the last vestiges of respect for Henri III. He was no longer seen as a leader. He was seen as a hysterical, emotionally incontinent man who cared more for his male concubines than for the suffering of his people. After the duel, the king became even more isolated. He retreated further into his shell, his paranoia growing like a weed. He saw enemies everywhere, and he was right. His younger brother Francis, the Duke of Alençon, now Duke of Anjou, was a constant thorn in his side. Alençon was a small, pockmarked, ambitious schemer who was technically the heir to the throne. He flirted with the Protestants, he flirted with the Dutch, he flirted with anyone who would give him an army. He was the spare who wanted to be the heir, and he was willing to burn France down to get the crown. And then there was Henri of Navarre, the king's brother-in-law. Navarre had escaped the Louvre during a hunt in 1576, fleeing back to his own territory in the south. He had renounced Catholicism, returned to the Protestant faith, and was now leading a formidable Huguenot army. But the greatest threat remained the Duke of Guise. The League was growing stronger by the day. They controlled the press, printing pamphlets that depicted Henri III as a tyrant and a heretic. They controlled the pulpit, with priests preaching sedition every Sunday. Henri III tried to negotiate. He tried to buy peace. He passed the Edict of Poitiers, granting freedoms to the Protestants, only to revoke it when the Catholic League threatened war. He was a cork bobbing in the ocean, pushed this way and that by forces he could not control. In 1584, the final blow to the Valois Dynasty landed. Francis, the Duke of Alençon, the king's younger brother and the only heir, died of tuberculosis. The implications were terrified. Henri III had no children. His brother was dead. The Valois line was effectively extinct. According to the ancient Salic law of France, the crown must pass to the nearest male relative. And the nearest male relative was Henri of Navarre, a Protestant. The nightmare of the Catholic League had come true. A heretic was next in line for the throne of the eldest daughter of the church. The Duke of Guise saw his moment. He declared that a Protestant could never be king of France. He resurrected the claim of the Cardinal de Bourbon, a senile old uncle, as a puppet candidate. But everyone knew who the real power would be. The stage was set for the final act. Henri III sat in the Louvre, looking at the empty chairs where his mignons used to sit. He touched the pearl earring that had once belonged to Caylus. He knew the storm was coming. He knew the wolves were at the door, and for the first time in his life he stopped running. He began to plan. If he was going to die, he would take them with him. The stage was now cleared of minor players. The distractions of the balls and the bilboquets faded into the background as the true existential threat to the crown emerged. It was no longer a matter of court intrigue or petty squabbles over favorites. The destiny of the nation had distilled itself into a deadly geometry, a standoff between three titans who each believed they were the chosen savior of France. The time for compromise had bled out on the floor of the duelists. Now, there was only the cold, hard logic of survival. The dynastic crisis had ceased to be a question of succession and had become a battle for the very soul of the monarchy. By 1585, the map of France was no longer defined by borders or rivers, but by hatred. The country had dissolved into a three-way standoff known to history as the War of the Three Henries. It was a conflict that felt almost literary in its construction. Three men, all named Henri, all possessing a legitimate claim to power and all willing to burn the kingdom to ash to secure it. First there was Henri of Navarre, the Protestant, the fox. Charming, rugged, and perpetually broke, he roamed the south of France like a bandit king. He was the legal heir to the throne, but to the Catholic majority he was the Antichrist. His court was a moving carnival of soldiers and lovers, but beneath the laughter lay a brilliant military mind waiting for the Valois Dynasty to collapse. Second, there was Henri, Duke of Guise, the Catholic, the Lion. Tall, scarred, and immensely popular, he was the idol of the masses. He was bankrolled by the King of Spain, Philip II, who poured gold into Guise's pockets to destabilize France. Guise didn't just want to protect Catholicism, he wanted the crown. He believed the Valois were spent, a degenerate line that had lost the mandate of heaven. He saw himself as the new Charlemagne, and caught in the middle, trapped in the gilded cage of the Louvre, was our Henri III, the king, the shadow. He was a man fighting a war on two fronts with an empty treasury and a court full of traitors. He had no child. He had no money. He had no love. All he had was the crown, and it was slipping from his head. The years between 1585 and 1588 were a slow-motion car crash. Henri III tried everything to regain control. He issued the Treaty of Nemours, capitulating to the Catholic League's demands to outlaw Protestantism, hoping to appease Guise. It didn't work. It only made him look weak. He sent armies against Navarre, but secretly hoped Navarre would win, because if Guise won, the king would become nothing more than a puppet. The tension was suffocating. The air in Paris was toxic with sedition. The League's preachers, the firebrands of the pulpit, screamed that Henri III was a tyrant, a sodomite, a friend of heretics. They called for his deposition. They called for blood. And the Duke of Guise was listening. In May 1588, the inevitable happened. The king, fearing a coup, issued a direct order. The Duke of Guise was forbidden from entering Paris. It was a line in the sand. If Guise crossed it, it would be an act of open treason. On May 9th, Guise rode into Paris. He didn't come with an army. He came with just a handful of men. It was a masterstroke of theater. He rode through the Saint-Denis gate at noon, smiling, waving. The reaction was instantaneous. The city went insane. Shopkeepers abandoned their stalls. Women threw flowers from windows. Men ran alongside his horse chanting, "Hosanna to the Son of David." They tried to touch his boots, his cloak, his horse's mane. To the Parisians, he was not a traitor. He was a savior coming to rescue them from the effeminate tyrant in the Louvre. Henri III watched from the palace windows, pale and shaking. He had been defied in his own capital. His authority was shattered. Desperate, the king made a fatal error. He ordered the Swiss Guard and the French Guards, about 4,000 men, to enter the city and secure strategic points. It was a blunder of historic proportions. To the people of Paris, seeing foreign mercenaries, the Swiss, marching through their streets was a declaration of war. The rumor spread like wildfire. The king plans to massacre us. St. Bartholomew is happening again, but this time we are the victims. On May 12th, the city erupted. The day of the barricades had begun. It was the first time in history that the people of Paris used the tactic that would become their trademark in later revolutions. They rolled heavy wine barrels, barriques, into the streets, filled them with earth and stones, and chained them together. Within hours, the narrow medieval streets were blocked by hundreds of barricades. The king's troops were trapped. They were caught in a labyrinth of stone and wood. From the rooftops and windows, the people rained down cobblestones, furniture, and boiling water. The Swiss guards, unable to maneuver their pikes in the tight alleys, were slaughtered. They fired their muskets into the air to show they meant no harm, but the mob didn't care. They were dragged down and butchered. The king was a prisoner in the Louvre. He could hear the screams of his dying soldiers. He could smell the gunpowder. His advisors urged him to use cannon to blast a path through the city, but Henri refused. "I will not destroy my own capital," he wept. "I will not be the king of ruins." By afternoon, the Duke of Guise rode out to restore order. He walked through the barricades unarmed, tapping the rebels on the shoulder with a riding crop, telling them, "Enough, my friends, enough." The mob parted for him like the Red Sea. He saved the remaining Swiss guards, escorting them to safety. It was the ultimate humiliation for Henri III. Guise had shown that he held the power of life and death in Paris. The king was alive only because the Duke allowed him to be. That night, the Louvre was a tomb. The courtiers whispered that Guise would storm in the palace in the morning and force the king to abdicate, or worse. Henri knew he had to leave. On May 13th, under the pretense of taking a walk in the Tuileries gardens, the king and a small entourage made a dash for the stables. He climbed onto his horse, still wearing his court shoes and light cape. He rode out of the new gate, galloping away from the city that had rejected him. At the top of the hill of Chaillot, he stopped. He turned his horse around and looked back at Paris, the city of his birth, the city he had beautified, the city that now wanted him dead. According to legend, he cursed the city, swearing he would only return through a breach in its walls. He was a king without a capital, a fugitive in his own realm. Henri fled to Chartres, then to Rouen, and finally to the Château de Blois in the Loire Valley. He was broken. He was depressed. He spent days in bed, staring at the ceiling. The Duke of Guise was now the de facto ruler of France. But something shifted in Henri during those dark months. The fear that had paralyzed him for so long began to harden into something else, something cold and sharp, hatred. He realized that as long as Guise lived, Henri would never be king. Guise wasn't just a rival, he was a cancer. And you don't negotiate with cancer, you cut it out. But Henri was a master of dissimulation. He had learned from his mother, Catherine, that revenge is a dish best served not just cold, but with a smile. He decided to play the role of the defeated man. He signed the Edict of Union, granting Guise everything he wanted. He named Guise Lieutenant General of the Kingdom, the very title Henri had held in his youth. He agreed to summon the Estates General at Blois to discuss the succession. Guise was triumphant. He believed he had won. He believed Henri was a spent force, a coward who was too busy praying and playing with his dogs to be a threat. "He does not dare look at a goose, let alone a Guise," the Duke reportedly joked. Guise arrived at Blois in October 1588 like a conquering hero. He was arrogant, dismissive. He slept with the king's mistresses. He sat in the king's chair. He openly mocked the king's piety. Catherine de Medici, now old and sick, suffering from a lung infection that made every breath a struggle, watched with growing dread. She knew her son. She knew that beneath the velvet and the pearls, the Valois blood was boiling. She warned Guise. "Beware," she whispered. "The king is not what he seems." But Guise laughed. He felt invincible. He had the church, the people, and the army. What could one lonely man in a silk doublet do to him? December 1588. The Château de Blois was cold and damp. The wind howled around the stone towers. The atmosphere inside was thick with conspiracy. Henry III had made his decision. He summoned a select group of his bodyguards, the famous 45. These were Gascon gentlemen, tough, loyal provincials who owed everything to the king and hated the arrogant Parisian nobility. On the night of December 22nd, the king called the captain of the 45, Loignac, to his private chambers. "Do you have a dagger?" the king asked. "Yes, sire," Loignac replied. "Does it cut?" "It cuts well, sire." "Good," Henry said, his eyes dark and unreadable, "because tomorrow I need you to cut out a tumor that is killing France." The plan was simple but terrifyingly risky. The king would call a council meeting at 8 a.m. on December the 23rd. He would invite Guise to his private cabinet, the Old Cabinet, ostensibly to discuss urgent business. The 45 would be waiting in the antechamber and the bedroom. If it failed, Henry would be dead by noon. The Guise faction would slaughter him. Henry didn't sleep that night. He paced the floor of his room, praying, weeping, checking the locks on the doors. He ordered the guards to block the staircases. He had the keys to the castle brought to his bedside. At dawn, the sky was a bruised purple. It was raining. The Duke of Guise woke up in his apartments. He had spent the night with his mistress. He was tired. His nose was bleeding slightly, a common ailment for him, but his superstitious entourage saw it as a bad omen. As he dressed, he found a note in his handkerchief. It was anonymous. It read, "Warning, they are planning to do you harm." Guise read it, laughed, and wrote at the bottom, "He would not dare." He threw the note into the fire. The council chamber was cold. The fire was dying. Guise stood by the hearth, eating sugared plums from a box, chatting with the other lords. He complained of the cold. His nose began to bleed again. He asked for a handkerchief. At that moment, the Secretary of State, Revel, entered the room. He was pale as a sheet. He was shaking so badly he could barely speak. "My Lord Duke," Revel stammered, the king requests your presence in the Old Cabinet." Guise nodded. He wiped his nose, threw his cloak over his shoulder, and strode toward the door. He twisted his mustache, a gesture of habitual vanity. He walked out of the council chamber and into the antechamber. There, leaning against the walls, sitting on chess, pretending to play dice, were the 45. As Guise entered, they stood up. They bowed. It was a sign of respect. Guise walked through them, heading toward the door of the king's cabinet. He reached for the handle. Suddenly, Montserrat, one of the guards, grabbed Guise's arm. "A word, my lord?" Guise turned, confused. "What?" Before he could finish the word, Montserrat drove a dagger into his chest. "Traitor!" Guise roared. The giant duke was strong, incredibly strong. Even with a dagger in his chest, he threw Montserrat off. But now the others were upon him. It was a frenzy of steel. Daggers plunged into his back, his neck, his legs. "Help! Treason!" Guise screamed. His voice boomed through the castle walls. Inside the council chamber, the Guise loyalists heard the scream. They jumped up, reaching for their swords. But the doors had been locked from the outside. They were trapped. They could only listen to their leader being butchered. Guise fought like a bear. He dragged his attackers across the room. He was bleeding from a dozen wounds, his gray satin suit turning crimson. He staggered, arms flailing, knocking over a table, smashing a vase. Finally, with a groan that shook the floorboards, the Duke of Guise collapsed at the foot of the king's bed. He gasped once, twice, and then lay still. Slowly, the door to the king's cabinet opened. Henri III emerged. He was dressed in a simple velvet robe. He looked pale, almost ghostly. He walked over to the body of his enemy. He looked down at the man who had humiliated him, the man who had driven him from Paris, the man who had wanted his crown. The Duke lay sprawled on the floor, his arms wide, his massive frame taking up a huge amount of space. Henry stared at him for a long time. Then, according to the witnesses present, he did something that chilled them to the bone. He nudged the corpse with his foot. "My God," Henry whispered, a strange mixture of awe and relief in his voice. "He looks even bigger dead than he did alive." He turned to Lognac. "Is it done?" "It is done, sire." Henry let out a breath. He seemed to have been holding for years. He looked up at the ceiling, his eyes filling with tears. "Now," he said, "I am King of France alone." He ordered the body to be burned and the ashes thrown into the Loire River so that no relics would remain for the League to worship. He then went downstairs to the apartment of his mother, Catherine de Medici. She was lying in bed, frail and dying. She heard him enter. "Madam," Henry said, his voice trembling with a terrifying joy, "the King of Paris is dead. I have recovered my kingdom." Catherine looked at him with her tired, heavy eyes. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She knew the world better than he did. She knew that blood calls for blood. "You have cut out the cloth, my son," she wheezed. "But now you must stitch it back together." The assassination at Blois was intended to be a surgical strike, a decisive blow to restore the king's authority. But in his desperation, Henry had miscalculated the depth of the infection. He had treated the symptom, the Duke, while ignoring the disease, the fanatical hatred consuming his people. The silence in the royal chambers was fleeting, a mere intake of breath before a scream of collective rage that would shatter the fragile peace Henry thought he had won. Far from securing his throne, the king had just signed his own death warrant, setting in motion a chain of events that would leave no room for mercy, only for martyrdom. Catherine de Medici was right. She usually was. When Henry III walked into her room, flushed with the adrenaline of murder, boasting that he was finally king alone, the old Queen Mother looked at him with the weariness of a woman who had seen too many ghosts. She died just 12 days later, on January 5th, 1589. It was a miserable end for the Black Queen. She died with the taste of failure in her mouth, knowing that her favorite son had just destroyed everything she had spent a lifetime building. With Catherine gone, the last guardrail was removed. The news of the Duke of Guise's assassination hit Paris like a physical blow. The city did not cower, it screamed. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. The Sorbonne, the theological heart of France, released a decree releasing the French people from their oath of allegiance to Henry III. They declared him a tyrant, a murderer, and a traitor to the faith. The priests in the pulpits whipped the mobs into a frenzy. They called him Vilain Hérode, Villain Herod, an anagram of his name, Henri de Valois. They smashed statues of the king. They dragged his portraits through the mud. The Catholic League, now led by the Duke of Guise's surviving brother, the Duke of Mayenne, and his sister, the fanatical Duchess of Montpensier, declared open war. The Duchess famously wore a pair of golden scissors at her belt, boasting that she would use them to tonsure the king, meaning she would forcibly shave his head and lock him in a monastery for the rest of his life. Henry III was stunned. He had expected the murder to decapitate the League. Instead, he had created a hydra. Every drop of Guise's blood seemed to spawn 1,000 new enemies. The cities of France fell like dominoes. Amiens, Dijon, Toulouse, Marseille, they all declared for the League. The king controlled only the Loire Valley and a few scattered towns. He was a king without a kingdom, trapped in the Château de Blois, while the wolves howled at the gates. He was alone. His minions were brave, but they were few. His treasury was empty. His mother was dead. He had only one card left to play, a card so desperate, so unthinkable, that it made his Catholic ancestors spin in their graves. He had to call the heretic. In April 1589, A courier rode south with a letter from the King of France to the King of Navarre. The message was simple. Come, we must save France together. It was the ultimate irony. Henri III, the hero of Jarnac, the man who had authorized the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, was begging the Protestant leader for help. The meeting took place on April 30th at the park of Plessis-les-Tours. It was a scene of high drama. On one side, the Swiss guards of the king in their velvet and armor. On the other, the rugged Huguenot veterans of Navarre, looking wary and dangerous. The two Henrys rode toward each other. They hadn't seen each other in years. Henri of Navarre dismounted first, a gesture of respect. Henri III dismounted and walked toward him. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Was this a trap? Would one kill the other? But then the King of France opened his arms. The two men embraced. A cheer went up from the soldiers. Vive le roi! Vive Navarre! It was the sound of the impossible becoming reality. That night the two Henrys dined together. They were a study in contrasts. Henri III was pale, elegant, eating delicately with a fork, a utensil he had helped popularize. Henri of Navarre was boisterous, smelling of garlic and leather, laughing loudly, his eyes twinkling with the energy of a man who loved life. But they shared a common enemy, the League, and they shared a common goal, Paris. Together they were unstoppable. The Royalist and Huguenot armies merged into a force of 40,000 men. They swept through the countryside, capturing towns, crushing resistance. The League's forces crumbled before them. By late July 1589, the unholy alliance stood at the gates of Paris. The king set up his headquarters at the Château de Saint-Cloud on a hill overlooking the capitale. He could see the spires of Notre Dame. He could see the Louvre. He was coming home, not as a penitent, but as a conqueror. Paris, he reportedly said, looking down at the rebellious city, you represent the heart of France, but you require a bloodletting to be cured, and I shall perform it. Inside the walls, panic set in. The League leaders knew they couldn't withstand a siege. They told the people that if Henri III returned, he would burn the city to the ground and slaughter every Catholic. They prayed for a miracle. And, in the twisted logic of religious fanaticism, a miracle appeared. His name was Jacques Clément. He was 22 years old, a Dominican friar with a simple mind and a burning soul. He had been told by the preachers that Henri III was the devil incarnate. He had visions. He saw angels with flaming swords telling him to save the church. The League recognized a useful idiot when they saw one. They encouraged him. The Duchess of Montpensier may have even met with him, whispering that if he killed the tyrant, he would not only save Paris but earn a martyr's crown in heaven. They gave him a letter of introduction, forged to look like it came from a royalist spy inside the city. On the morning of July 31st, Clément left Paris. He walked toward the royal camp at Saint-Cloud. He was stopped by the guards, but he showed them the letter. I have secret intelligence for the king, he insisted, for his ears only. The guards were suspicious, but the king was desperate for news from inside the city. They let him pass. Tuesday, August 1st, 1589, 8 a.m. Henri III had just woken up. He was in the Château de Saint-Cloud, sitting on his commode, a private latrine chair, in his bedchamber wearing a dressing gown. He was relaxed. The siege was going well. He expected to be in the Louvre within days. His attendants told him a monk was waiting with urgent news. Henri, always pious and respectful of the cloth, ordered him to be brought in. Jacques Clément entered the room. He looked harmless, a young, slightly confused friar with his hood pulled up. He bowed low. He handed the king the forged letter. Henri took the papers and began to read. Clément stepped closer. He leaned in as if to whisper a secret. Sire, the monk whispered, As the king leaned forward to listen, Clement reached into his wide sleeve and pulled out a long, sharp knife. With a grunt of exertion, he drove the blade straight into the king's lower abdomen. The shock was absolute. Henri roared in pain. He ripped the knife out of his own gut and struck Clement in the face with the hilt, shouting, "Wicked monk, he has killed me!" The guards burst into action. They didn't try to arrest Clement. They annihilated him. They ran him through with their swords, threw him out the window into the courtyard, and hacked the body to pieces. The assassin was dead before he hit the ground, but the king was bleeding. At first, the doctors were optimistic. The wound didn't look fatal. Henri was calm. He dictated letters to his wife and the governors of the provinces, reassuring them. "It is nothing," he said, "a scratch." But as the afternoon wore on, the fever spiked. The pain became excruciating. The knife had perforated the bowel. Peritonitis, a slow, agonizing infection, was setting in. Henri III, the man who had danced in pearls and whipped himself in the rain, knew he was dying. And in these final hours, as the shadows lengthened across the floor of the chateau, the frivolity and the indecision vanished. He became, finally, a king. He ordered the room to be cleared of everyone except his closest officers and the King of Navarre. Navarre rushed to the bedside, tears in his eyes. He knelt before his cousin. Henri III looked at the Protestant leader. He knew what he had to do. He knew that if he died without naming an heir, France would dissolve into chaos. He had to put the state above his faith. "Brother," Henri whispered, his voice raspy with pain, "the crown is yours." He turned to his Catholic officers, men who hated Navarre, men who had spent their lives fighting him. "I command you," the king said, his voice finding a sudden steel-like strength. "I command you to acknowledge my brother here as your king. He is the legitimate heir. Obey him as you have obeyed me." Then he pulled Navarre close and whispered a final warning, a prophecy that would ring true down the centuries. "But remember, Henri, you will never possess Paris unless you become a Catholic." He confessed his sins. He forgave his assassin. And in the early hours of August 2nd, 1589, Henri III closed his eyes for the last time. He was 37 years old. When the news of the king's death reached Paris, the city did not mourn, they celebrated. The Duchess of Montpensier drove through the streets shouting, "The tyrant is dead." Bonfires were lit. People danced in the ashes of their own hatred. They called Jacques Clement a saint, but their celebration was premature. Henri III's death was the end of the House of Valois, a dynasty that had ruled for 261 years, that had built the foundations of modern France, was extinguished. The curse was complete. But from the ashes of the Valois rose the House of Bourbon. Henri of Navarre, now Henri IV, would take the advice of the dying king. He would fight for 4 more years, but eventually he would convert. "Paris is well worth a mass," he would famously say. He would unite the kingdom, end the religious wars, and become one of the most beloved kings in French history. But he built his glory on the ruins of Henri III's life. History has been cruel to Henri III. For centuries, he was remembered only as the king of the mignons, a caricature of effeminacy and weakness. He was the man with the earrings, the man with the lapdogs, the man who lost the kingdom. But looking back now, we can see the tragedy of a man who was too intelligent for his time and too damaged for his role. He was a Renaissance prince trapped in a medieval slaughterhouse. He sought love in a world of treason. He sought peace in a world of fanatics. In the end, Henri III was not a villain. He was a mirror reflecting the madness of his age. He was a man standing on the bridge of a sinking ship, trying to hold back the ocean with his bare hands. He failed, yes, but in his final moment in that blood-stained room at Saint-Cloud, he did the one thing that mattered. He passed the torch. He ensured that while the king might die, France would live on. And perhaps in the silence of history, that is enough.